We've got a good group here, so let's get started with our presentation. My name is Alicia, she, her, hers. I'm from the New York Abortion Access Fund, and we are here this. We are going to share some local examples of campaigns, as well as some tools and lessons learned to invite you all to think about how you might bring or build a abortion funding campaign in your city, because these are an amazing opportunity for places with progressive policymakers to directly support people accessing abortion, as well as really take a stance and push back against unjust federal policies like the Hyde Amendment. So we're each going to introduce ourselves briefly so you know who's talking with you today. Again, my name's Alicia, New York Abortion Access Fund, or NIAF for short. And I'll invite my panelists to also introduce themselves. Erica?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, y'all. My name is Erica Galindo. I am with the Lilith Fund. I'm the organizing program manager from the Rio Grande Valley, but based out of Austin, Texas. So hello, Jenny.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Dotson Mystery. My pronouns are she and her. And I am the Associate Director of Local Advocacy at the National Institute for Reproductive Health. Excited to be here today.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kelsey Woida, although all my movement friends call me Woida, so I consider all of you to be new friends. I use she and her pronouns, and I work for All Above All. I am the Development and Special Projects Coordinator.
We'd also like to hear who you all are. I've already seen some chatting in the chat box. Be sure to send a message to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see. We'd love for you to introduce yourselves and also to share what you're hoping to get out of this workshop, because we have a lot planned to share with you, but we also want to make sure we are sharing what you want to learn as well. So please take a second to introduce yourselves in the chat box. And we're also going to launch right now a poll, our first poll, to learn a little bit about you as well. Great, so you should see the poll now. Let us know what brought you here this morning. Great, got to see someone here from Brooklyn, looking to bring back information to Midwestern communities. Love to see that. Make sure you fill out the poll if you haven't already. And 20, if you see that most people have filled out the poll, feel free to close it and we can see the results. I can't see the results, turns out. There we go. All right. So people want to learn about advocating at the city level, absolutely. Kind of a mix of curiosity, love for abortion funds, we love to see it, interest in city budgets, yeah, that's great. And folks feel like they need more information. Good, so that's a good place to start with this webinar. Feeling like maybe ready, need more information. Hopefully by the end of this webinar, you either have the information you need or you know where to get it. Because what we are gonna cover this morning is a campaign in New York City to fund abortion, a campaign in Austin, Texas to fund abortion, and then some tools, resources, how you can plan your own municipal city funding campaign. If you have questions that come up while we are talking, we would love to hear them. So please, especially if you are in the Zoom tool, to use the Q&A box at the bottom. That will help us to keep the questions and our answers organized for you. But you're also welcome to drop comments or things in the chat. Us co-presenters will be watching that and making sure we respond to everything that comes up during our presentation. And we'll have plenty of time at the end for those questions. So I get to kick us off with the Fund Abortion NYC campaign. Again, I'm Alicia from NIAF, the New York Abortion Access Fund. And if you're here, if you're at this conference, you probably know about abortion funds, but just in case, we help people who are facing barriers to abortion. That means financial assistance, connection to other resources. It also means advocacy, organizing, breaking down those barriers so that all people can access and afford their abortions. NIAF helps people who are living in or traveling to New York. And even in states like New York, of course, people are facing barriers. Some folks might have federal insurance or even state insurance, sometimes doesn't cover abortion, even in New York. Some people can't use their insurance for privacy or safety reasons, might have a high deductible. Whatever their reasons, we're here to help. And we know that our governments should be doing better. They should be filling in these gaps, making sure every single person can access and afford abortion. So that's what we aimed to do with our campaign. Originally, this campaign in New York City emerged out of some conversations. NIAF and the National Institute for Reproductive Health, you met Jenny, who's going to speak again later, started talking about what opportunities we had in New York City, a place that we know was supportive of abortion access, to pursue greater access and funding directly, potentially. We had some conversations with our local Department of Health, and we ended up making a decision to launch a public campaign. We were going to ask the city council and the mayor to fund abortion by directly giving money to NIAF to help us help people access abortion through the city's annual budgeting process. So like many cities, it can vary a little bit, but in New York City, we have this yearly budgeting process. So NIAF and NARH came together along with a bunch of other coalition partners. For years, we've been working together with organizations across the state to advocate together, often for state legislation. And for the first time, this campaign was going to bring this coalition together for city legislation. We launched in fall 2018. There is a national effort called the Hyde Week of Action to draw attention to the Hyde Amendment, which restricts federal funding of abortion, and also draw attention to what can be done about it, which is passing legislation at the federal level, but also cities like New York City stepping up. We originally had the hashtag NYC Won't Hide. You might see on the archway back there, we did one of those public demonstrations to rally our supporters around this new campaign. We changed our hashtag because a lot of people don't know what the Hyde Amendment is, and Fund Abortion NYC makes it really clear what we're asking for. And we came together with partners like the National Asian and Pacific Islander American Women's Forum, their local chapter, some grassroots organizations like Women's Health and Reproductive Rights in Brooklyn, the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice and their local chapter, all these groups coming together to say, we agree that the city should fund abortion and let's do something about it. It was really important for us to have that shared political expertise, communications expertise, understanding of the abortion funding landscape, all that combined knowledge and resources, the power of all our supporters coming together was going to make this effort that much stronger. We did a second sort of public launch with our city council allies in this press conference that you see pictured. That's one of my fellow board members, Caitlin, speaking at this rally. Behind her is the champion that we found, Councilmember Helen Rosenthal, someone who is elected to office in New York City, who we knew was really supportive of abortion access and who was willing to help us to be a public face, to talk to her colleagues in the city council and be that behind the scenes advocate for us, as well as help us navigate the city council process, because budgeting can be really complex. And so she helped us know what we had to do to get funding. So that's when we kicked off our lobbying efforts. This was before the public budgeting process started. We went to council members, we went to citywide elected officials like the mayor, and we told them, first of all, what we do, because most of them don't know what abortion funds are. And second of all, we told them what a huge impact it would have for the city to fund abortion. In New York City, there are many residents who need help affording their abortion. And we also have people that travel from outside of the state to New York City. They travel from states that have more restrictions, more limits on being able to access abortion. And New York City is a place that they can go for access. So we were having those conversations. We made fact sheets, right? We were educating our elected officials, laying that sort of base of knowledge, making it so that once the budgeting process did kick off publicly, they would know to support abortion access. And once that budgeting process did kick off, that's when we mobilized our supporters in like full force. We were doing emails into the council, phone calls into the city council, creating those, those online action alerts, getting people to send messages, take action. In the left photo that you see on the slide, you see a room full of supporters who we brought together for a training about the campaign, about how to lobby their elected officials. In the right photo, you see some supporters at NIAF's annual Bowl-a-thon fundraiser. We thought, what better opportunity than when hundreds of our supporters come together to get them to take action with us. So this was all throughout the spring of 2019, just finding every opportunity we could to educate and mobilize our supporters, get them to advocate with us, lobby our elected officials. What no one could have seen coming, that really then bolstered that campaign, was a national outcry around near total abortion bans that were being passed in states like Alabama, Ohio. These laws were creating a huge uproar across the country, including in New York. Our policymakers, our lawmakers were responding to these bans publicly. We're saying, this cannot be tolerated. This is not acceptable. And because we had laid all this groundwork in the campaign, we said, yes, absolutely. And guess what? You can do something about it in New York. So we were at those rallies. On the left photo, you see one of our supporters speaking at a huge citywide rally. On the right, you see one of our elected officials in New York City, the city comptroller, Scott Stringer, pulled together a press conference to say that we need to fund abortions in New York City. So all that groundwork we had laid really paid off, because we were able to take that moment of national attention on abortion access and get New York City policymakers' attention. Campaigns don't often have a moment like this. You're not always going to have national attention on an issue in the moment of a campaign, but so often we see in campaigns like this that you need the combination of having laid the groundwork and that timing to work out. It happened to work out for us in that first year. And so we kept up that drumbeat of directly lobbying our council members. And what ended up happening behind the scenes is that there's a women's caucus in the city council, And they decided, especially the chairs of that caucus, council members Carlina Rivera and Margaret Chin, they decided to really champion abortion funding to make it a priority for them in the city budget. So when the budget was announced that June, we won. We were so thrilled that we had made history. In fact, New York was the first city to directly fund abortion. The city allocated our full requested amount of $250,000 to NIAF. It was a thrill. Tears were shed, celebrations were had. And as an organization that previously had been almost entirely funded by individual smaller donations, it was so important that we could now count on New York City to step up, step in, support abortion access. So that was a really exciting first year for our campaign. And that was 2019. So coming into 2020, as I mentioned before, this is an annual process. So that means every year having to ask for the funding again. It looked a little different this year. Initially, so this is January, February, it looked different just because when you ask for funding for the second time in the city's budget process, it's easier, at least in New York. This could vary by city. Once a funding stream is in the budget, it's more likely to be refunded in the budget, especially because we're asking for $250,000. New York City's entire budget is $86 billion. So as far as the city is concerned, our funding is very small. As far as our callers are concerned, it's huge. And we also still had our council member champions, still in office, still able to continue championing that funding. So we initially didn't mobilize as large of a grassroots effort. We did that direct lobbying. We sent letters into council members and had meetings. We were re-engaging those champions. But it wasn't until the pandemic hit and there were some economic, financial concerns for the city budget that we started to worry a little bit more. We started to think, okay, we want to make sure that abortion funding isn't on the chopping block for city funding. So we were mobilizing our supporters a little bit more, driving those messages in, sending emails. Of course, everything was virtual at this point. So what you see pictured on the slide is that bowl-a-thon that we have turned into a virtual fund-a-thon. And we asked our supporters during that event to call their council members, send those emails, tweet their council members, right? Finding creative ways in this virtual environment to get people to take action. Closer to the budget decision time, we actually also did a virtual rally with our council member, Carlina Rivera, that champion that I mentioned in the Women's Caucus. So we were doing all these virtual tactics. And also during this time in the midst of the budget process, demands for justice for Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others led to this wave of protests for Black lives, this outcry against police violence, including in New York City. And the protests drew attention, of course, to defunding the police. It was a position that NIAF hadn't taken before. We hadn't advocated to defund the police before, but we knew that it was very much in line with our mission and our vision for a world where all people have the freedom to live their lives, the control of their own destinies and their reproductive destinies. So we joined, along with many other abortion funds across the country, in calling New York City to defund the police. We shifted our mobilization a little bit to drive in those messages, those emails, those calls to both defund the police and fund abortion, to fund a wide range of community services and life-affirming services like abortion access. In the end, New York City did renew funding for abortion. They failed to respond to those community calls to defund the NYPD, but we know every year this campaign continues, so we are going to continue this effort as we move into the next budgeting cycle. With that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Erica to talk about the campaign in Austin, Texas.
Hey y'all, thank you so much, Alicia, for that. And I am very excited to talk to y'all about our campaign in Austin. So hello again, my name is Erica Galindo. I'm the organizing program manager for Lilith Fund. We are an abortion fund based in Central Texas, and we serve Central and Southeast Texas. when folks need help paying for their abortion. So literally, we have a hotline where people can call us, and we fund folks in Austin, San Antonio, and Houston, all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley, which is where I'm from. Um, we also do organizing and advocacy work, whether it's at the state or local organizing and advocacy work, which is what this really beautiful campaign ended up being. So yeah, we actually in Austin, we could not advocate for abortion, as I will get into a little bit deeper, but we could get a little bit creative, which is why we asked for abortion support. Um, so yeah, so next slide, please. Um, so just some background. Lilith Fund, we participate in a program called Repro Power. It's a statewide program, but it's different cities throughout the state who take on local work through this umbrella called Repro Power. So Lilith Fund, with our partners at Narrow Pro-Choice Texas, we had spent years building relationships with local council members in Austin. So this meant in 2017, Lilith Fund, this was before my time, and Narrow got the city council to pass a resolution that literally stated abortion is healthcare. And it's literally just what that states, a very controversial statement in Texas, unfortunately, sometimes, that abortion is healthcare and therefore it should be protected. In 2018, we again approached city council to ask them to pass another resolution called Rosie's resolution, and this was named after Rosie Jimenez. And this resolution just basically stated who Rosie was, right, which was a person from the Rio Grande Valley who ended up dying after getting an unsafe abortion because she could not afford hers due to the Hyde Amendment. So we restated that in the city level. We also asked for, this was in before the 85th legislative session started. And so basically we were going to be engaging in work that involved Rosie Jimenez. So we really wanted local council to take a stand and to ask state leaders to also remember who Rosie was and to do their best to make sure that they could pass laws so that Rosie Jimenez would never happen again. So basically, we were laying this groundwork these last couple of years to make sure that city council stated on record that they were pro-abortion, and then also that they were supporting us, and we were just building those relationships, right, with city council members. Next slide. So basically, at this point, as was mentioned, in 2019, we had a really weird climate. The Southern abortion ban wave was just rolling. In this photo, this is like after Alabama had banned abortion. And we had also just closed out the 85th Texas legislature, which was not, given everything, it sucked because there was anti-abortion laws passed, and one of them included SB 22, which basically stated that local governments could not have any sort of contract on the books with abortion providers. So the state was really emboldened, right, to do whatever they could, whatever technical trap laws they could pass. That's targeted regulatory against abortion providers. And then we also had the NIRH local index, which was actually very useful for us because in that index, it also stated that Austin didn't do too hot. I think we came out with like a 2.5 star rating out of 5 stars, which basically meant that like Austin had work to do if we really wanted to achieve reproductive freedom. Thank you so much, Wida. So we knew that we had a field of landmines, and it was time to get really, really creative. So we knew that SB 22 also had just passed, which meant that we could not, necessarily do anything on the books with the government as far as funding abortion, but we could find some sort of workaround, which meant funding abortion support. So basically, we had some work to do. Our work was laid out in front of us. We put together a menu of sorts. And on this menu, there was all sorts of things that the city could do to make Austin a friendlier place for people seeking abortions. So on that menu included things like Abortion Provider Appreciation Day, making sure that we commemorate that in Austin. It also included things like looking at our zoning laws to make things a little bit nicer for abortion providers. But one of the things that was on there was the budget amendment to support people as they were seeking their abortion. So we could not fund the abortion themselves, but we could fund transportation, we could fund lodging, we could fund childcare, we could fund doula or emotional support for people seeking abortion care, right? So everything but the procedure, essentially. So we presented this menu and we asked council members for their support, what they thought about it. And we actually did have some folks a council member who did want to take this up, Greg Kassar of District 4, actually my council member. And so it was on us to recruit other city council members into this this budget amendment, which it was a really fast turnaround. I say this, it sounds like months of work because it was, but we actually did this in a matter of weeks because the city budget negotiations were just about to start, like literally the next month. So we had a couple of weeks to talk to other council members, get their support, figure out if they wanted to sponsor, to vote. Then while we were doing that, we also had to talk to our community and be like, hey, y'all, we have this wonderful idea. We actually might have some traction at City Hall. We need you all to show up for this rally. We need you to call your city council members. We need you to testify. We were looking for really key constituents to testify at that budget hearing because we knew that the city needed to hear from people who had had abortions, who were providing abortions, who fund abortions. So we really needed to get them up in front of the city hearing. And we needed folks to show up and rally because we needed to demonstrate like public support that like abortion is popular, as we know it is. So we did that all within a matter of a couple of weeks. And so next slide, please. Thank you. It passed. It actually passed, and the city approved $150,000 to the budget in 2019 for abortion logistical support. It was the first, New York had just passed funding from the city to abortion. And so this was like a different kind of way that a city could support abortion, even if the state was a hostile space. So the following year, 2020, was a whole different year, right? Because now we had actual partners who had applied for this funding. So we needed to talk to them, right? Because they were the folks who were actually providing logistical support for people seeking abortion. So the folks who would actually be doing the work, we deliberated with them and said, hey, what do y'all want to do for 2020? Like, budget negotiations are coming up. We need to figure out what we're asking. The other thing that was happening was that there was a historic, uprising for the movement for Black lives and defense of Black lives throughout the summer. And there was protests like erupting all throughout the nation, including Austin. Just historic, beautiful protests against police brutality in defense of Black lives. And there was a loud call to defund the police. And there had been so much work already in Austin, from local organizers, folks like the Communities of Color United, folks like Grassroots Leadership, people who had already been asking the city to be better about police oversight, to actually fund things that people needed versus funding the police. So we knew that we could do our best to be in line with the movement for reproductive, like it's part of a reproductive justice framework. And it also just made all the sense to join these partners and not necessarily be competing, but rather say this is a complementary ask. You can fund abortion, you can defund the police, you can do what people need in Austin. And it was more of like a harmony of asks. And so the ask was to do this again, but to add $100,000 extra, so $250,000 for abortion access from the police department's budget. Right, we were being very deliberate about where we wanted this money to come from. We wanted it to come from the police department because we knew that when you defund the police, you have more money to fund care like abortion support. So we did it again. We made sure that we led with our values. Next slide, please. We made sure that every single communication that we had to council, whether it was emails and petitions that we were asking our supporters to sign, meetings that we had with them, we made sure that that ask was in solidarity with the community calls for defunding the police. And we were just very like upfront and bold about that. We went directly to council and we asked our previous year's champions, so Greg Kassar, Delia Garza, all of those folks, and we asked them to please champion this again. And then we also had to really have like a strong social media ask because we were in the middle of a pandemic. So we made sure that like we were bringing in our supporters with us, asking them to, we put together a form with Narrow Pro-Choice where it was on their website where they literally, folks could just fill in their information, find out who their council members were, and then we would send an email on their behalf using this language and making sure that, you know, it got to their city council members, because city council was just getting bombarded like with calls from all over the city because everybody wanted them to defund the police basically. And so basically we did it again. We managed to fund abortion support, and we did it in the middle of a year that was just wildly, I mean 2020 has been wild, but we made sure that, you know, even in the middle of a pandemic, as there are very serious discussions about how cities spend money, we made sure that some of that money was going to abortion access. So we got $250,000 for abortion access, which in the big scheme of city budgets, not a lot, but as Alicia mentioned, it's huge for people who call our hotline, people who are seeking abortion in Texas, but because of all of the laws cannot, because they either can't make time off work, or there's nobody to watch their kids, or there's nobody to be with their, like in the room with them as they need somebody. So some of the takeaways that we really learned from this whole thing, next slide please, was really just that it's super duper important, right, to lay that groundwork and to build those relationships at City Hall. The ask in 2020 would not have gone as, I won't say smoothly, but you know, it would have been a really hard year when we could not go into the city council and have those meetings with folks. Like, it would have been almost impossible if they didn't already know who we were, didn't already see our work, didn't have like existing working relationships with each other. And so that was really, really important. The other thing is that we made sure to lead with our values. We made sure that our asks were not at odds with what other organizers in our city were asking for and what their priorities were, which was like defunding police for racial justice, for Black lives. And so we made sure that our ask was just kind of complementary to that ask, and that it just kind of made sense in the grand scheme of thing. We really laid it out for city council members of like, hey, this isn't out of left field. Actually, it makes complete sense. This is reproductive justice. And, it would be awesome if you could do this and take it from the police budget. So that's really what we learned, is just to be bold, to stand with our partners, to stand with folks across movements, and to really make that ask and lay that out for city council members. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it now to our friends at NIRH and all of the fall.
Thank you so much, Erica and Alicia. Hi, everyone. Hi again. So now that we're all feeling super pumped up and inspired by the work of our friends at NIAF and Lilith Fund, my colleague Jenny and I are going to talk about how the heck to plan your own abortion funding campaign where you live. You can imagine air horns and fireworks here. So we have developed a planning guide which takes you through the key information you'll want to consider and need to know while creating a strategy for your campaign. But before we dive into that tool, I want to provide a little background context about our work. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I work with All Above All, and we are a national campaign led by women of color, focused on ending bans on insurance coverage of abortion, including the Hyde Amendment. For the last 44 years, the Hyde Amendment has blocked people enrolled in Medicaid from getting abortions, and we know that this most deeply impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color, immigrants, young people, LGBTQ communities, and families who are already struggling to make ends meet. In addition to our work to end Hyde, we also do proactive policy work with our state and local partners and movement building work with partners in economic and immigrant justice. And we're really trying to reimagine a bold future that's built on reproductive justice values, where everyone can access the abortion that they want and need, and everyone can thrive no matter where they live or how much money they have. I'm going to turn it over to Jenny so she can tell you a little bit about NARH before I talk about our partnership. So take it away, Jenny.
There we go, unmuted. Thank you, Woida, and thank you, Erica and Alicia, for your really inspiring presentations. It makes me so excited. So as I said, I'm Jenny Mystery, and I'm the Associate Director of Local Advocacy at the National Institute for Reproductive Health. We work on the local and state level across the country in support of proactive policy initiatives to advance reproductive health rights and justice. We do that in several different ways. We're based in New York City, so we do our own advocacy in New York City and New York State, which is why Alicia mentioned that, that we were directly involved in NIAF's campaign here. And then we also do messaging and policy development for the field. But when we're working on the state and local level, we work through a partnership model. And our thought is that the most innovative and exciting work is really happening on the local and state level. And so that's where we want to be working, but also that part of why it's so effective and exciting is because it's led by people on the local and state level who live in the communities where they're working. We are all based in New York. So we work in partnership with organizations on a range of initiatives, and that includes strategic guidance and technical assistance, and oftentimes funding on all kinds of issues, but relevant to this project, focused on municipal support for abortion coverage and funding.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, so All and NIRH have been partnering together since 2012 to support different local initiatives aimed at ending the Hyde Amendment and restoring abortion coverage in local communities. We know that when local leaders champion policies to fund abortion, it can send a really strong message to state and federal decision makers and kind of have a trickle up effect. Today, there are 25 cities and counties across the country that have passed resolutions in support of ending Hyde, which is really exciting. And we have the 2 municipal funding streams in New York and Austin that you just heard about. Next slide, please. So you want to fund all the abortions. Welcome. We know that every city and county is home to people who are impacted by abortion coverage restrictions, including the Hyde Amendment. Even in states that do provide Medicaid coverage of abortion, many people are still subject to the Hyde Amendment's restrictions, and there are definitely gaps that still exist. I know Alicia mentioned some of those in New York, what they hear on the hotline at the abortion funds. Some examples of people who are still impacted by Hyde at the local level include people incarcerated in federal detention facilities, Indigenous people who might access healthcare through Indian Health Services, undocumented people, and many more. And beyond just the cost of the procedure, even if it's covered by Medicaid, there are still other financial barriers that push abortion care out of reach and impact folks. So there are no hard and fast rules about who can advance a local funding stream. Clearly, we would love to see these everywhere and ultimately abortion funded in every community. But we do have some nice to have features of like a locality. So these aren't required must-haves, but they might help you decide if you're ready and if your city or county is a good candidate for municipal abortion funding. So we have an abortion fund already exists in your area. This can be an abortion fund or another service provider that is based in and serves folks in your community that can commit to implementing a grant. You might have progressive local government, capacity for budget advocacy. So you and your movement buddies can commit to at least a year of advocacy. That's generally the timeline. Demonstrated support for abortion access. This can vary from place to place, but it can look like maybe you've already passed a local resolution in support of ending the Hyde Amendment. Maybe your city has passed a buffer zone policy to support abortion clinics when it comes to protesters, things like this that are kind of laying the groundwork. And then finally, an established coalition is really important. Hopefully one with strong communication that includes the direct service organization or abortion fund who will be applying for and ultimately receiving the money through the funding stream. Next slide, please. So we really see municipal funding as part of longer term strategies to change culture over time. So you might not have all of the elements that I just named in the last slide, and you might still decide to move forward with a campaign, which is totally fine. You don't have to worry. We trust that advocates know what's right for their communities, and we know that changing culture can take a long time. So you might decide that launching a campaign will help you build support on the ground that's important to your longer term goals, or that it might help cultivate important relationships with local elected officials and champions who you want to build with in the future, even if it's unlikely to lead to funding in the current budget cycle that you're working in. You might have started sweating a little bit when I named a progressive local government as a nice to have. We know every local context is different, and some of these things might feel really far away in your current local context. So you might decide that launching a proactive campaign with really bold, values aligned messaging feels critical to push for now instead of waiting for the tides to change. That being said, these campaigns do take a lot of time and work, as evidenced in both Alicia and Erica's presentations. It's really amazing, everything that they've been able to pull off. But if you don't feel like you're ready to launch a municipal funding strategy, don't sleep on resolutions. Resolutions are awesome. They're a great place to start especially if your locality hasn't passed one yet in support of ending the Hyde Amendment. It can be a really great organizing tool that allows you to work more closely with local officials who you're building relationships with and with your public supporters in the community. They can allow you to assert your community's values and pave the way for future campaigns as part of that groundwork that Erica mentioned too, in terms of laying that groundwork. So if people are interested, if anyone here thinks like, yeah, my community might be ready for a resolution, We have seen a lot of local electeds are interested in doing these around the Roe v. Wade anniversary, which is at the end of January. So definitely please reach out to us and we can talk more later about what that might look like if you want to start planning now. So I'm gonna pass the mic to Jenny so she can walk you through more of our guide.
Yeah, thanks, Waida. Waida, I can't remember if you said this, but we do have language for a draft resolution. So, everybody can write their own, but if you want to pass one and want a template, don't hesitate to reach out. Next slide, please. So our toolkit is pretty detailed in the nitty gritty of how to pass a resolution, or sorry, a funding stream. And I'll talk about all the nitty gritty on the next slide. But we start with 5 key questions that if you were to reach out to us and say, I want to get started on a funding stream, these would be the first that we would really want to figure out how to answer together. So the first, of course, is which locality do you want to work in? And this could be, we have 5 cities that might be good places to start. Let's pick one. It could also be, do you want to focus on the city or the county level in the one community where you want to get started? We go into how to make that decision to answer all of these questions in the toolkit. The second question is, do you think that the funding you could win would only be able to cover residents of that locality? So in New York, the funding, and Alicia or Erica, correct me if I'm wrong, but in New York, the funding is open to everyone, but the procedure has to happen in New York City. In Austin, the funding is limited to residents of Austin, but can be used, anywhere, even out of state. So that's a really important question to answer because it will impact how much money you ask for, how you structure the ask. In general, our preference is that it would not be limited at all. It would be great if it was just funding to the fund, but if it has to be limited, we tend to prefer for it to cover services in the city because that can benefit more people. But in Austin, it's still incredibly beneficial for those residents, especially given that many, especially for later abortions, may have to travel. So either way is great. A lot of it will depend on the preferences of your local leaders, and we can help you figure that out. Then, of course, when is the budget approved? This is mostly about timeline. We want to build out from when passage is. You heard from Erica that, when they got started, there was only a few months to go, or a few weeks to go before the budget was approved. And we were able to stand up a campaign really quickly. You might decide to do that if you end up in that situation. Or you might say, hey, this budget could be, we could get this through in a few weeks, but actually we aren't ready and we want to hold off. And it's amazing how fast a year goes. So I think that's another discussion to have, but helpful to have the information. Then the question is, does your state preempt local funding for abortion as Texas does for the procedure? So we want to research that and then figure out how can we support people's financial access to abortion if the procedure itself is preempted. And then the last question is, do you want this to be a public or a behind the scenes strategy? So in New York and in Austin, both of the strategies were very public. And that's obviously ideal because it educates people about the need for funding. Hopefully a few more folks will learn about the insidious Hyde Amendment and how harmful it is. And of course, it's a great base building, culture change, organizing opportunity. That being said, if you win the funding, that's extremely impactful on people who can benefit from that. So if you decide because of your elected champion's preference or the culture of your community or any real reason that this should be more of a wonky behind the scenes strategy, that's okay. We really just want to win the funding. But it's helpful to know up front because it will impact, do we need to build in a whole comms campaign, et cetera. Next slide, please. So before I get into the nitty gritty, I did want to just pause for a second on preemption, because it really does come up in this context in particular. So for those of you who aren't familiar with preemption laws prevent municipalities from setting their own policy, or they will override policies that have already been set. This is really common, for instance, in minimum wage. Many states have banned cities from setting a higher minimum wage than whatever the minimum wage is in the state. It comes up with paid sick leave quite a bit, bans on discrimination, particularly on the basis of gender identity, we've seen preempted quite a bit, and also on funding for abortion care. The conservative states, despite the fact that they talk about, federalism and states being able to decide and all of that, are actually huge fans of preemption. You can even find preemption for things like, plastic bag bans. It actually is quite a broad challenge for all of the progressive movement. So, so the good thing about that is that there are a lot of groups that work on preemption. Progressive groups that you can ally with. So if you're in a red state and you're a blue city, you really want to think carefully about, first of all, are you preempted? But more importantly, if you do win and pass this funding, is it possible that the state legislature will take notice and then preempt and ban funding for abortion care, a law similar to what they have in Texas? So we often find that folks in red states want to work on this, which is awesome. We have great blue city leaders and organizers in red states. And we really talk to folks in that situation about how to think about whether it's worth it. So the first is, are there really strong progressive coalitions in general working against preemption? There's some great messaging on it. There's a lot of really innovative ideas on how to fight back against preemption, and it might be an opportunity to join that coalition and really start to build some cross-movement partnerships. There's also the thought of if we win and then get preempted, are there still benefits to doing that work? So if we get preempted, but we've had this really big campaign, will more people know about the Hyde Amendment and start to come onto our side and understand that abortion is healthcare, and that our state is really hostile to funding reproductive healthcare for folks. There could be things that even the preemption battle itself might highlight and might really educate and build your base for the future. Both of those two benefits are, in my opinion, dependent on this third bullet, the future of the political landscape. So, educating people about the Hyde Amendment is great. Building cross-movement partnerships is great. But what we really want is the funding. So what we do is talk to people and ask them, do you think that if this is preempted, is there any, is it going to change the landscape? So let me give an example. In Atlanta, for instance, where they almost had a demonstration.
Sorry, Jenny. 20, we're hearing some background noise. If you could go on mute, please.
Okay. Fighter. So in Atlanta, Stacey Abrams almost won the governorship. We're not saying that Atlanta shouldn't move forward on municipal funding. Were they interested to do that? But it might be worth thinking about, do we want to wait and pass this? Because right now we have a really hostile governor and legislature. They would preempt it immediately, and it would be really hard to undo. And if Stacey Abrams or someone else won the governorship in a few years, they would veto any preemption, and then we'd be safe. So, that's one way to think about, maybe we should hold off, the side benefits aren't worth it. If you're in a place like Little Rock, where it seems unlikely that there might be a supportive governor or one body of the state legislature for a while, you might as well move forward, because the side benefits are still really beneficial. and you're unlikely to have municipal funding of abortion either way for a while. So, we can get into this with you, but I wanted to just put that on everyone's radar depending on the context you're in. Next slide, please. And so then this is the nitty gritty that I was talking about. These are the sections of the toolkit. Where, who, when, and what. We help you answer all of those questions. Where should the funding come from? Who should be funded? An abortion fund, or in some cases, it might be a different entity. When, how are you going to build out your timeline? And then what will the final funding stream really look like? And how much money are you going to ask for? All of that. Preparing for advocacy talks you through how to get ready for an effective campaign and how to do all of the background work to make sure you submit a really informed request for funding. Logistics and nitty-gritty gets really nitty-gritty and wonky. This is like, find out if you ask for $29,000, can you just get that grant, versus if you ask for $30,001, it triggers an RFP that any entity in the city could actually apply for, and you might not win the funding. You might still want to move forward with that amount of money for an RFP. And then we'll help you think about how can we make sure that the RFP is written so that crisis pregnancy centers aren't actually eligible to apply. So we get really detailed in there. And then we talk a lot about how to work with, oh, great, Marie. We could talk more about that. Yeah, it's a real concern. And actually, I think Erica might have some insight too. And then, of course, working with elected officials. How do you identify your champion? We give you a sample meeting agenda. We give you all the top questions to ask. So it's really useful because it's so detailed. We're not publishing this toolkit or posting it on our website anywhere. So if you're interested, just email us. Our contact info is on the last slide, and we'll share it with you. Next slide, please. And so this is just an example of the strategic guidance and technical assistance we'll offer in addition to that toolkit. We are here to support you. There's nothing we're more excited about than finding new cities to try to bring this campaign to. We, this past year, hosted a monthly cohort call, or every other month, with all of the folks who are working on these initiatives. It's not just New York and Austin. There's really a range of places that are considering this, from cities in pretty red states to super blue cities and super blue states. It's really great to have that space to share. Messaging and media. Woida's going to talk about messaging in a minute, but media outreach, we really can offer a lot of support on: press releases, letters to the editor, etc. Organizing and advocacy with elected officials, as we mentioned, that can include doing some message training for elected officials. We had a few elected officials in New York and maybe in Austin too that didn't use messaging we loved. So that's always available now. We've got those talking points ready. Navigating the coalition and building cross-movement partnerships, and then of course working through all of the nitty-gritty. That seems to cover a lot, but honestly, if there's another question you have, we're really here to brainstorm with you. We are learning as we go along. We've learned so much from the work in Austin and New York, and so we really want to work closely with everyone who is doing this in their community to learn, because every city is different, but we can apply the lessons to the work we do elsewhere. Next slide, please. I'll turn it back to Woida.
All right, I am mindful of time and I want to leave room for questions. So if folks do have questions, please feel welcome to put them in the Q&A, and we will open up the floor after this. But one example of like some of the technical assistance that we provide is messaging and communication. So this year in particular, so much has been happening. We really took some time to think about how to communicate the connections between the COVID-19 pandemic, police violence, and the uprisings for Black lives, increasing unemployment and the financial crisis that we're in, and abortion restrictions. We've been really inspired by our partners' work at the intersections, which include meaningful collaboration with growing calls to defund the police. And we also know that it can be tough to explain why abortion access continues to matter, even when local decision makers are really overwhelmed and kind of flooded with budget requests related to the pandemic. But we know that it does matter still. So it's important to have really like simple and clear ways to communicate that. So we have been thinking through all of that, and we've just finished some 2020 messages that we're sharing hot off the press with our partners this week. And this is something that we can also share with folks on this call if you're interested in messages that could help at any stage of your advocacy. So I've included, the tool kind of walks through like naming and framing the problem, connecting it to different themes of racial justice and equity, and then moving towards solutions with simple messaging. I've included some examples here, and I'll just read them quickly and then we can move on to questions. So the pandemic has disrupted people's lives in unprecedented ways. People have gotten sick, lost their jobs, and are caring for children who can't be in daycare or school. Financial stresses are greater than ever. The burdens are falling hardest on women, especially Black and Brown women. The most marginalized in our communities, essential workers, communities of color, undocumented people, young people, those living in rural areas where hospitals have closed, are those hit hardest by both the virus and restrictions on reproductive health care. Economic disparities were already growing before the pandemic, and they disproportionately affect women and people of color. Now the divide between the haves and have-nots is growing. Police violence, wage gaps, and inequities in healthcare, abortion care, housing, and education aren't separate issues. They are all rooted in systemic racism that denies the humanity of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in their ability to thrive. So this is just one tiny slice of this messaging guidance that I wanted to share with y'all. But again, if you have any questions or would like access to these resources, we are open to sharing the planning guide with you, the draft resolution language, and these local messages.
Wonderful. So with that being said, we really welcome any lingering questions, curiosities. I wanted to return back to this sort of question of the city budget and how you make sure the money goes to the right place. Because one thing that I noticed is that the process looked a little different in New York City in a way that I didn't describe. And in your city or cities that you're working in, it may look that way too. So this is something that you would want to explore depending on where you are. But in New York, what NIAF did was actually in the budget process, there is a step in the process that's already built in for any organization that wants to request funding. So what that actually looks like for NIAF is that each year in the budget, at the beginning of the budget process, we submit a form, essentially. It comes with it's a form of many forms, but essentially we ask directly for the $250,000 and how we're going to use it. And then during the budget process, they sort of vote and decide on whether to make that allocation. So we weren't worried about the money going to the wrong place because we were directly asking for the money to go to NIAF. So that process made it maybe simpler in that way than other cities might have, like Austin. But hopefully that's clarifying to folks.
Yeah, and I can just add to that, that when you do need to have a request for proposals or applications, you can try to work with the folks who actually write that RFP on the city to, basically ensure that, we can come up with different ways to phrase it, but what immediately comes to mind for me is if you're applying, you must support abortion access or make comprehensive referrals or support comprehensive reproductive health care, including abortion, et cetera. You can also educate the people who are deciding about
Yeah, so it's about 12:10 right now, which gives us 5 minutes left. And I don't see any unanswered questions in the Q&A. So what I thought was that if you want to, each of us could just go around and say one last sort of thought about what comes next for you, or what might come next for our attendees. In New York, we are starting to have some of those strategic discussions, checking in with our coalition partners. The New York City budget every year, there's this whole process from January to June around opportunities to advocate, and of course us having to submit our proposal again in February. So those internal behind the scenes conversations are happening about what our strategy is going to be, so we are ready to go in the spring when that mobilization and public facing campaign has to get going.
I can say what's next for us. I think right now with All Above All, we are figuring out which cities we'll be working really, really closely with next year. Because we just had our own RFP close and got lots of applications for folks who want to work on this in their community. So you should keep an eye out. In February, we'll probably share some of those cities, but I also want to say, if you're interested in this and you didn't put in a submission, that's okay. We won't be able to offer you funding for next year, but we work closely with everyone who wants to work with us. We got lots of people reaching out to us, you know, in the middle of the year last year, and we'll work closely with you. So please, you see our contact info on there. Don't feel like you missed your chance. As I said, we want to work everywhere, and we're really excited to see what next year brings.
And I'll let Warda and Erica share as well, but also we can launch that second and final poll, because we'd love to just get a sense of where folks are at now as we're wrapping up. Warda or Erica, go ahead.
Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, I'm just echoing what Jenny shared. I'm just really excited to see where our local work goes next. It really is a work in progress and a process of experimentation and creativity. And it's so wonderful to bring our cohort of amazing partners from across the country together, where we all get to learn from one another. And then at the federal level, you know, All Above All is continuing our work to end the Hyde Amendment. We are continuing to connect with more members of Congress to get them to co-sponsor our federal bill, the Each Woman Act, which would restore abortion coverage for everybody. And we're also working to hold the Biden-Harris administration accountable to some of the promises that they've made on the campaign trail to end Hyde. And their public support for ending the Hyde Amendment is really important for us to leverage and continue to push them on. So fingers crossed, and we'll see what 2021 has to bring.
Thank you all so much for your work. As far as Lilith Fund and what our next steps are, I was shuddering as Jenny was talking about preemption, because our Texas legislature session is starting in January. And so, you know, we will be doing proactive work, including introducing with our partners Rosie's Law, which would allow Texas Medicaid to cover abortion, and we're constantly trying to move that needle. And that's some of our work that we love to do also with our partners here. So, you know, also fingers crossed that, you know, Texas does not try to preempt this win in Austin, but if they do, we're gonna fight like hell, as we always do every session. And, you know, make sure that we try to the best of our abilities, defend abortion in Texas and figure out how to fund it no matter what. Thanks, y'all. Really appreciate it. And then, you know, as far as the city budget itself goes, we're going to have to check in with those partners of ours who did, you know, that are funding abortion support through this win, and see how, you know, we'll approach the upcoming funding season. And so, yeah, not sure what exactly that's going to look like, but we do know that it's going to be hell of a fight. We're going to do it. So yeah, thanks, Alicia. Back to you.
Yeah, so with that, we are going to wrap up. You've had our emails there on the slide if you would like to stay in touch, and we really hope you do. I know a couple folks said in that final poll, like, still not sure whether we're ready for a campaign, and that's okay. That's a great place to be in, and that's why Jenny and Woida and so many other organizations have tools and resources and just can talk through what might be possible for you or for the cities that you live or work in. So we hope that that is useful. Thank you to Justice Now, to our host today, helping us with the tech. And thank you all who have attended. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.